Afternoon, and welcome back to my channel. I'm the Epileptic Explorer, and today we will continue our reading in Painkiller by Barry Meier. This was a series on Netflix, and this goes over the history of the opioid crisis. Now, I compare this to what's going on in modern day, which in this case is the equivalent of all these other drugs that are out there, like heroin, which is also mentioned in here, right? Yeah, heroin, weed, marijuana, as well as excuse me, ugh, as well as the other drugs that are sold on the market. So, and I'll get to the name of that one, the big one that's been um, killing people for years. Well, not years, but I would say as of recently. But I will get back to remembering what that drug was. But without further ado, let's continue reading Painkiller. Mm. Chapter 8. By mid 2001, federal lawmakers also started to wonder when Purdue executives had first learned about the abuse of Oxycontin and whether they could have done more to curb it. And that August, a panel of the House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee held a public hearing at a meeting hall in Ben Salem, Pennsylvania, a working class suburb of Philadelphia. Here, company officials would offer their first testimony about those questions under oath. Lawmakers had chosen Ben Salem as the site for the hearing because an area doctor, Richard Paulino, Paolino, had been recently arrested on charges of running a pill mill that spewed out thousands of prescriptions for Oxycontin. Over a 5-month period, Paolino, who was an osteopath, not, not a cancer specialist or a pain expert, had written 1,200 prescriptions for Oxycontin and about 9 prescriptions a day. During Paolino's time prescribing, 5 people around Bensalem, 4 of them teenagers, died of drug overdoses involving oxycodone. The hearing took place at a pivotal time for Purdue. Only a month had passed since the company, following discussions with the FDA, had sent out its nationwide alert warning doctors about Oxycontin abuse. Some states, concerned that the costly painkiller was consuming their budget for prescription drugs, had begun to require doctors to obtain special approval before prescribing it. The drug was still a blockbuster, bringing in more than $1 billion in sales, but the controversies surrounding it had slowed its rate of anticipated growth. Along with Michael Friedman and Howard Udell, the group of company officials at the hearing included Dr. Paul Goldenheim, Purdue's top medical officer, and his chief public relations official, Robin Hogan. In his opening statement to the congressional panel, Friedman tackled the central issue first. He said Purdue had first become aware of the abuse of Oxycontin in early 2000. As a result of articles newspapers, in Maine newspapers, and when the U.S. Attorney there sent out an alert to doctors in the state. Purdue immediately implemented a response team that included some of the company's top executives and scientists, including those who are here today, Friedman said. That team has committed Purdue to an unprecedented program to combat abuse and diversion. The congressman leading the panel, Representative James C. Greenwood of Pennsylvania, did not ask Friedman why Purdue had relied on newspaper articles to monitor abuse of its drug. Instead, he focused on the more fundamental issue of the IMS database, that showed how doctors were prescribing OxyContin. If Purdue had real-time data from the IMS database, he he asked, why weren't company officials alarmed when they saw how many prescriptions Dr. Paulino was writing? When you see a doctor who is not associated with Fox Chase Cancer Center, but is a little osteopath here in Bensalem doing this vast number of OxyContin prescriptions, what do you do with that information? Greenwood asked Friedman. Friedman's response seemed well rehearsed. We have learned over the years that the absolute number of prescriptions that a physician is prescribing is, in and of itself, not an indicator of the doctor doing something wrong. We don't measure or assess how well a doctor practices medicine. We are not in the office with a physician and a patient, observing the examination or involved in that process. We know, for example, Greenwood cut him off. Why do you want that information then? He asked. Well, we use that information to understand what is happening in terms of the development of use of our product in any area, Friedman replied. You want to see how successful your marketing techniques are? Greenwood asked. Sure, Friedman said, glancing back at his Purdue colleagues for support. Greenwood then returned to his first question and asked Friedman to explain why Purdue used IMS data to measure its marketing success, but not to monitor whether doctors were properly prescribing OxyContin. That is the other side of your responsibility, Greenwood said. Why wouldn't you have been using this data to make sure that the Dr. Paulinos of the world weren't wrecking the reputation of your product? Howard Udell leaned forward and whispered to Friedman, I think Mr. Udell might be able to respond to that more, Friedman said, yielding the witness table to the lawyer. When he took over, Udell insisted that Purdue couldn't have known from the IMS data alone that Paulino was running a pill mill. Law enforcement officials, he said, were far better suited than a drug maker like Purdue to investigate problem doctors. Okay. His answer didn't satisfy Greenwood. It seems to me that your company has a responsibility to be looking at this data and not relying on what law enforcement tells you, he said. I don't understand why that hasn't been something that you have been aggressively doing. Udell decided little was to be gained from arguing. I think we learned a lot from the case of Dr. Paulino, he responded. The picture that is painted in the newspaper is of a horrible, bad actor, someone who preyed on this community, who caused untold suffering, and he fooled us all. He fooled law enforcement. He fooled the DEA. He fooled local law enforcement. He fooled us. Udell's quick thinking managed to blunt Greenwood's questions, and the Bensalem hearing ended without any damage to Purdue's reputation. Company officials set out clear lines of defense at the hearing that they would repeatedly invoke in the face of other lawmakers and investigators' questions. The first defense was that the company couldn't have known if some doctors were bad actors who peddled pills because it wasn't in a position to judge how doctors practiced. But more crucially, Purdue executives would persistently claim, both in sworn testimony before Congress and also in letters sent to the company's sales reps, that there had been a defining moment when Purdue had become aware that OxyContin was being abused. The precise time would vary by aware that OxyContin was being okay. The precise time would vary by a few weeks, but executives insisted that become the company only became aware of the problem in the early months of 2000, when Jay Bedkowski, the U.S. Attorney in Maine, issued his alert. In December 2001, 4 months after the Ben Salem hearing, Paul Goldenheim testified before a Senate panel that reports of OxyContin's abuse had taken Purdue entirely by surprise, because the company had not seen any unusual abuse or diversion of OxyContin's predecessor, MS Cotton, during the 17 years that powerful opioid had been on the market. Purdue had no reason to expect otherwise with OxyContin, Goldenheim said, but the bright lines that Purdue officials sought to draw, federal investigators later discovered weren't clear cut. In fact, 3 years before Goldenheim's testimony, Purdue executives learned that MS Cotton had become a favored street drug and that OxyContin might face a similar fate. That information came from a study performed by researchers from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. That was published in 1998 in the prestigious Canadian Medical Association journal. The university researchers hadn't set out to look for MS Cotton abuse. Instead, they decided to interview drug abusers and dealers in a seedy downtown section of Vancouver to learn about the types of prescription drugs for sale there and the prices those drugs were commanding. The prevailing wisdom, as Purdue had told the FDA when seeking approval for OxyContin's special claim, was that the time-release opioids such as MS Cotton and Oxycontin would be less appealing to drug abusers. But to their surprise, the Canadian researchers found that MS Cotton was turning up frequently on the street for sale and also had the highest black market price of any prescription narcotic because of its high levels of pure morphine. Drug users had also learned how to defeat MS Cotton's time release system by scraping off a tablet's outer coating and then crushing and dissolving the pills so that the morphine written in it could be injected, researchers reported. MS Cotton tablets had been nicknamed peelers because you peeled away a tablet's outer coating. A green MS Cotton tablet, which contained 15 milligrams of morphine, was called a green peeler. A stronger, purple colored tablet containing 30 milligrams was known as a purple peeler. That same issue of the Canadian Medical Association Journal contained an editorial written by an emergency room physician, Dr. Brian Goldman, which warned that OxyContin could also end up on the street. In the editorial, he said the results of the Vancouver study contradicted safety claims made by Purdue and others for time-release narcotics. Goldman wrote that the Vancouver researchers appeared to be among the first to publish evidence on the street value of controlled-release opioid preparations, so-called peelers. It has been argued previously that controlled-release preparations might be less desirable as drugs of abuse than immediate-release pharmaceuticals. The relatively high street price of controlled-release opioid analgesics reported in this study clearly indicates that these drugs are coveted. This should ring alarm bells. The manufacturer of one brand of morphine sulfate tablets, MS Cotton, has warned that the injection of the drug obtained by street crude methods could result in local tissue necrosis and pulmonary granuloma, granu, granuloma, conditions produced by the injection of talc, which is used as a binding agent in the manufacture of pharmaceutical tablets. These issues need to be resolved. Then Goldman, give me 1 second really quick. Okay, not too far. Okay. Then Goldman referred directly to the risk posed by OxyContin. Now that controlled release OxyContin has been licensed in Canada, we expect that it and other controlled release opioid analgesics analgesics will also find their way onto the black market. There is no evidence that Purdue sent the Canadian report to the FDA or to doctors in the United States. The drug maker apparently had good reasons not to, if widely publicized. The study and editorial would have undetermined the foundation of high-powered marketing cam- Let me check real quick. The foundation of the high-powered marketing campaign that Purdue had just launched for OxyContin. Years later, Brian Goldman, who was a consultant to Purdue at the time his editorial was published, would say that the company never contacted him about it. By 1999, a year before the Maine morning, Purdue officials were made aware of OxyContin abuse by another source, the company's own sales reps, and one of those reps, Kimberly Keith, promoted OxyContin to doctors in Lee County, including Art Van Zee. Keith, after each visit to a physician in her territory, wrote a call report, a brief memo describing that meeting. Such memos were a standard practice in the drug industry, and a rep used them to make note of any issues that a doctor might have brought up about a drug and to jot down ideas about ways to increase the doctor's prescribing. One doctor Keith regularly visited was Richard Norton, who practiced in Duffield, Virginia, just 20 miles east of Van Zee's clinic in St. Charles. And by mid 1999, she was filing call reports about how Norton's patients were abusing Oxycontin by crushing a tablet with their teeth and then swallowing or snorting oxycodone. Her notes, written quickly, contained abbreviations, typos, and misspellings. After one of these visits to Norton, she wrote, said patients not doing so well because chewing oxy, etc., upset they that can break tablet down, not that they have figured out how to do it, discuss giving it to the right patients wouldn't be a concern. 2 weeks later, Keith filed a new call report reflecting co- Norton's comments made during another visit with him. It read, said very disappointed that Purdue doesn't make a chemical delivery versus a mechanical. Asked why. Because Pats are chewing Oxycontin and getting a rush, not not seeing a lot of patients with necrosis from hypodermic injection. Said she said was going to MS Cotton because didn't seem to get the buzz or your euphoria like with Oxycontin. Need to discuss next time. Purdue also became aware in 1999 of increasing newspaper articles about Oxycontin's abuse, as well as the arrests of doctors prescribing it. Early that year, for example, police and state drug agents stormed a pain clinic located in a small rural town in Northern California called Redding. They arrested the clinic's operator, Dr. Frank Fisher, who had written hundreds of prescriptions for Oxycontin, and charged him with fraud as well as murder in connection with the deaths of three of his patients from drug overdoses that involved oxycodone. Prosecutors showed that in 1998, Fisher had written a startling 46% of all the prescriptions for Oxycontin issued through a California state program for low-income patients. That same year, a pharmacy near his office had purchased nearly 4 times as much Oxycontin and other oxycodone-containing killers as any other retail drugstore in the United States. The drugstore's owners owners denied any wrongdoing, while Fisher maintained that his prescribing practices reflected new medical views about the need to use such drugs more aggressively in pain treatment. Court records showed that expert witnesses working for the state of California contacted Purdue in 1999 for information about Oxycontin because the drug was still a relatively new product on the market. Years later, Fisher's defense lawyers would recount that they also had quickly got in touch with Purdue to seek the company's assistance in mounting his defense. Fisher later said he spoke directly to a Purdue physician as well, who told him that the company would not get involved in his case because its executives were conservative and liked to avoid controversy. By then, Purdue was monitoring media reports for any mention of Oxycontin abuse. That spring, two Purdue sales reps turned up at the offices of a tiny newspaper in West Virginia, the Weirton, in the Weirton Daily Times, to ask for a copy of a recently published article in which William Beatty, the head of a local narcotics task force, warned that a new drug scourge was taking hold in the area. Too much heroin and too many oxycontins are hitting the streets in the upper Ohio Valley. Beatty's article said at about that same time, a Purdue sales rep in western Pennsylvania reported back to the company that authorities there had sent out an alert to area doctors about both MS Cotton and Oxycontin. The drugs have found a niche in the illegal recreational drug use setting, the alert stated. The pharmaceutical drug abusers have found a way to circumvent the oral administration to negate the long lasting effect of the drugs, thus producing a speed type of high from the drugs. The local street price runs from $30 to $60 per pill. Before 1999 ended, Purdue would learn about the arrest of other doctors on Oxycontin-related charges. One of those cases involved a Florida doctor, James F. Graves, who was charged with manslaughter in connection with the overdose deaths of four patients to whom he had prescribed a combination of drugs. Graves, a former Navy doctor, had bounced from job to job before finally opening an office in Pace, Florida, a small town near the city of Pensacola in the state's Panhandle section. He didn't have any special training in treating pain, but his small office was attracting large numbers of patients complaining of pain. He prescribed he prescribed them a mix of medications dubbed by local pharmacists the Graves cocktail, and included narcotic painkillers such as Oxycontin and Lortab, as well as tranquilizer Xanax. His patients who died all had histories of drug abuse, but some of their parents would later testify at Graves' trial that they had pleaded with him not to prescribe their children more drugs. Word spread that he was the go-to doctor, a Florida prosecutor told the jury during the physician's trial. He is no different than a drug dealer. A Purdue sales rep, Leon versus Dulian, testified that he started hearing complaints in 1999 from area pharmacists that Graves was inappropriately prescribing Oxycontin, particularly higher strength tablets that contained 40 or 80 milligrams of oxycodone. He was also concerned that Graves was using a Purdue promotional campaign to give patients free samples of Oxycontin. Within the pharmaceutical industry, it is standard practice for sales reps to drop off small free sample packets of a new drug at doctors' offices as a way to encourage physicians to prescribe the medication to patients under DEA rules. Drug companies are not permitted, under DEA rules, drug companies are not permitted to give out free samples of narcotics. But Purdue and other opioid manufacturers had found a work around it. Instead of sample packets, Purdue sales reps annually distributed thousands of coupons to doctors, each one good for either a 7-day or a 30-day trial supply of Oxycontin. A physician could give a patient a coupon to take to the drugstore and get the painkiller for free. In internal budgets, Purdue put the annual cost of its giveaway program at $4 million. Dulian told prosecutors that in the first few months of 1999, he received 30 such coupons and gave six of them to Graves. Each one was good for a free 30-day supply of the painkiller, a quantity large enough for a patient to develop significant dependence or even addiction to an opioid. Then Julian overheard a conversation in another doctor's office that suggested to him that Graves was using the Oxycontin coupons to make money. Two people waiting to see the physician were discussing the types of drugs available for sale on the street. Their conversation turned to Graves and how he used to give out a coupon. That would get you all your Oxycontin for free. If the patient agreed to sign up for a long distance telephone service that he was marketing as a side business, Julian also testified that the same two people discussed the popularity of Oxycontin with drug abusers. One of them said, "On the street, the number one abused drug is crack cocaine, which they call the devil's dick." Ugh, sorry. Um, the devil's stick. There we go. Followed by Oxycontin, which they refer to as the devil's. How am I going to say this? Which they refer to as the devil's. Mm, how am I going to say this? How am I going to say this? Which they refer to as the devil's dolls. There we go. In mid 1999, Frank Fisher, the California doctor, was released from jail after the murder charges uh, against him were reduced to manslaughter. All felony charges against him were later dropped, and he was acquitted of related misdemeanor charges after a trial in 2004. Fisher remained a strong believer in OxyContin's value, and not long after his release, he attended a pain management presentation sponsored by Purdue. Years later, he would recall that he was stunned to hear the Purdue speaker repeatedly insist that the painkiller couldn't be abused because of its time-release packaging. All the nurses were laughing about it, Fisher said. He was so upset by the incident, he said, that he phoned Purdue's headquarters, where his call was directed to David Haddix, who had then just started working for a drug company. Fisher said he recounted the speaker's remarks. "David, you know that your lecturers are telling people you know that what your lecturers are telling people isn't true," he recalled, saying. Fisher described Haddix as sounding very concerned during their phone call, adding that the Purdue official had asked for the speaker's name. Fisher never learned how, or even if his complaint was addressed. He never heard back from Haddix. Haddix would later downplay early reports about Oxycontin's abuse, describing them as dribs and drabs. But that was not the case. In time, new evidence would emerge to show that in late 1999, long before Purdue executives testified in Congress, Haddix had urged them to enact a crisis response plan to OxyContin's growing abuse. His call went unheeded. Let's see, do I have enough time to get to the next chapter? Um, and yeah, I think we'll hold off for right now. Yeah, we'll hold off. Yeah, we'll hold off for right now. I'll read this next part in a little bit. I do want to add, though, that I do want to add the drug I was thinking of that is out there to this day was, oh man, I just had it. Um, Oh, what is it? Rats. I don't remember what it was called. I just had it. I do it when I'm not thinking. Um, let's see here. It's oh man, I can't think of what it's called. I'll remember it in the next video. But for those of you that are watching this, if you're trying to get more information, this is a great source to have about the history of the opioid crisis with OxyContin and the dangers of it being used for current and future drugs and the causes of what they can cause. So, for example, this has gone over deaths of the different drugs that happen in this book. The drugs that happened back then are happening to this day, and no one's hardly doing anything about it. So, ugh. So keep in mind, please, if if you are if you are someone that's addicted and doing drugs, or is having a hard time getting off drugs, one thing I will say is this gives you a reason why you should stop as of right now. These are testimonials of what happens when you are addicted. And if anything, please seek help. This gives you an insight of what drug addicts do, what happens when you abuse the drugs, like marijuana, cocaine, oxycontin. All these drugs that are talked about in here are happening to this day. Some of them not as used, but the ones that are as of current, which I wish I could remember what the name of that drug was. I'm sure it'll come to me. So, anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this book. And I hope you all enjoyed the next video. So until then, I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon.